My name is Carter Charles. I am an assistant professor here at BYU in the Department of Church History and Doctrine. And I have been asked the job that I generally don't like, that is to be the police, the master of the clock for this session. I will introduce the speakers in the order of the program. Edward L. Carter is a journalist and lawyer with degrees from Brigham Young University, Northwestern University, and the University of Edinburgh and Oxford University. Think about it. I learned English-speaking British accents, and I can't say Edinburgh. A professor of communications at BYU, he has authored dozens of articles on media, law, and free expression. He has represented journalists and others in state and federal courts and has been an expert witness in free expression cases in Utah and New Hampshire. Professor Carter has had Fulbright experiences in Colombia, Chile, and he enjoys student mentoring trips to Latin America and Europe. I don't blame him for that, having lived in France for 17 years. He confesses to be an avid amateur of basketball, skiing, mountain biking, and the short stories of Jorge Luis Borges. He and his family, Kimberly, have 4 children. Thank you very much for bearing with us, and let's welcome Professor Carter.
Well, thank you, Professor Charles, for the kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here to share a few thoughts that I have. I'm a journalist, as you heard from the introduction, so that's the perspective that I come from, and in the field of scholarship examining the intersection of religion and media, there's an instrumentalist view in which mass media channels and technologies are used to deliver religious messages and spread a gospel message to audiences of believers and non-believers. But that's a view in which the media, as I said, are simply a channel. So there's a different view, an emerging view called religion as media. And in this view, the process of preparing and disseminating a religious message through a media framework actually changes the character of the religious message itself. So in this research, my research that I'm sharing today, I've concluded that a variation on that view is applicable in a Latter-day Saint historical religious freedom context. Instead of religion as media, I suggest that journalism can be a form of religious freedom. In this view of media as religion, it's not simply the character of the religion or the religious message that is altered through being shared, and neither is the mass media channel simply a static tool. The religious message and the media tool or channel interact and change each other, and that's what I think of as journalism as religious freedom. So this phenomenon is evident in the editorials of George Q. Cannon in the Western Standard, a newspaper he operated on behalf of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in San Francisco in 1856 to 1857. As is well known, Cannon's copious journal writings document much of his life, but this period of 1856 to 57 is a time in which he wrote very little in his journal. He did write in 1856 a short entry about finishing the Hawaiian translation of the Book of Mormon and publishing that, and then soon after, his wife Elizabeth, his first wife Elizabeth, gave birth to a son, and he wrote about that. In 1857, he wrote, he and his family suffering from influenza, a few business items, and a few short notes about directing the missionary work. He was in charge of the missionary work at that time in Northern California. In December of 1857, though, he has a slightly longer journal entry, and I apologize, this is small type. You don't have to read that whole thing, but if you want to see the context, it's there. On December 3rd, 1857, he wrote about his feelings upon leaving San Francisco. He was at that time returning to Utah due to the arrival of the Army in Utah and finishing up his time in San Francisco. And so the part that I'll highlight in the middle there, he said, "I have diligently labored to lay before them," the people in Northern California, the principles of salvation by means of the press and public preaching. So he specifically says, he was using journalism in his editorship of the Western Standard as a way to share the gospel message. But he goes on to say that for the most part, they turned a deaf ear and treated all our testimonies and warnings as idle tales. He was obviously a little frustrated because he then said, it's been no pleasure to dwell in their midst. Nothing but the knowledge that it was a duty sustained me. There was nothing in common between the Gentiles and the saints, the north and south, light and darkness. Maybe that view would be different if he were writing, some time after the experience, but at least at that moment we can sense some of the frustration he had. Just 2 days later, on December 5th, 1857, he wrote in his journal about an experience that he had riding the steamer from San Francisco to Southern California. I guess that was the route to get to Utah at the time. And then he was talking to a man named Mr. Waite, who was a former postmaster and newspaper editor in Los Angeles. And he said that they got into a conversation on what he called Mormon topics and the present attitude of the people of Utah. They became so engaged in this conversation that other people on the steamer gathered around to listen. And then Mr. Waite finally acknowledged, according to President Cannon, that George Q. Cannon had the best of the argument. He goes on to say, I talked plainly and pointedly on the subject of our troubles, defended the course of Governor Young and the people of Utah as being perfectly constitutional and proper, asserted that other people, whether of California or any other state, who had any spirit of freedom burning in their bosoms would take a similar course. And then at the end, he says that a U.S. officer on the way to San Diego listened in as well, and they were talking about their rights as American citizens and our principles, which I understand to mean principles of the gospel. So that's about it for George Q. Cannon's journal as far as his experience in San Francisco and his time as the editor of the Western Standard. There are some other academic research efforts with regard to early Latter-day Saint newspapers, obviously. And one of those is by an author named Harrison R. Merrill, a former journalism professor at BYU. In fact, in the 1930s, I think he taught the first journalism classes at BYU in the English department. So I consider him an intellectual and professional predecessor of mine. He earned a master's degree at Columbia University in 1930, and his master's thesis documented the history of Latter-day Saint newspapers and magazines during the century from 1830 to 1930. He chronicled more than 50 publications in various communities around the United States, as well as Europe and elsewhere. And his conclusion was that with the possible exception of the Deseret News, all of these other publications were, quote, inconsequential or non-entities. He was a member of the church, but he saw all of the publications as essentially meaningless in the secular journalism point of view. But he acknowledged, obviously, there was great importance to the church and its members. And I think his conclusion about publications like the Western Standard being inconsequential and a non-entity probably were due to, well, he said they were due to the short duration, short lifespan of those publications, as well as lack of operation by journalism professionals. He said there were a lot of wise people in the church appointed to be involved in newspapers, but not journalism trained. Although I think we could say George Q. Cannon had quite a bit of training in journalism, having worked as an apprentice for his uncle John Taylor in Nauvoo on the Times and Seasons, later the Western Standard in his late 20s, Deseret News, and Millennial Star, in his later years as well. So he was, I think we could consider a professional journalist. But Merrill wrote this of the Western Standard. He said, Elder Cannon, who possessed a fluent style and the power of appealing, especially to the younger people, filled his paper chiefly with editorials and comment. These were of a religious character and were designed to assist in instructing the saints. So I find that interesting that Professor Merrill talked about instructing the saints. I read the editorials a little bit differently, as mostly aimed at a non-church member audience, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. Another early study of Latter-day Saint news publications was published by Virgil V. Peterson in the Mississippi Valley Historical Review in 1948. And he concluded that Latter-day Saint publications in the first century of the church could be divided into three phases. He said there was a phase of migration, one of missionary activity, and one of colonization. And the Western Standard, according to his view, was put into the second phase, the missionary activity phase of those publications. Peterson stated that the Western Standard aimed to offset the adverse press accounts circulating over the country about the church. So a slightly different depiction than Professor Merrill there in terms of the purpose. And Peterson pointed out the Western Standard's own self-stated purpose. Its motto was, "To correct misrepresentation, we adopt self-representation." Nice alliteration there by George Buchanan. So it should be noted, as I said, George Buchanan did have a fair amount of newspaper experience, both before and after his Western Standard time. In addition, the life history of President Cannon is well known, his time in Congress and the first presidency, and 6 months in the Territorial Penitentiary for cohabitation. So there's a lot we could say about defining journalism and also defining religious freedom, and obviously not enough time to do that justice, but I'll make a few observations and then look forward to the other presentation and the conversation after. But I would define journalism as independent reporting of news that's relevant and in the public interest. So there's a lot of media content that would not be considered journalism. In fact, there's a lot of media content on ostensibly TV news channels and talk radio that is not, in my definition, high-value journalism. It might be considered entertainment or infotainment or simply, political propaganda and debate. But actual journalism is reporting of news in the public interest in an independent way, which we could distinguish from disinformation, which is intentional falsehood, misinformation, unintentional falsehood, and propaganda, government persuasion, which is sometimes true and sometimes not. So in the 19th century, American journalism was characterized by a partisan press approach, meaning most newspapers and magazines had an overtly political viewpoint, and they were open about that. They would state, we support this party, or these are our principles. The sort of economic and social imperatives toward objective journalism didn't really come along until the early 20th century. And so we could say that George Buchanan's newspaper, the Western Standard, which stated a perspective in favor of the church and elucidating church doctrine and combating misinformation and disinformation by church opponents, that in doing that, he was in the mainstream of journalism in the 19th century. So that was not an odd thing to do, to say I have a newspaper that has a certain point of view or perspective that I'm going to promote. So defining religious freedom is at least as equally complex as defining journalism. There's obviously a legal and rights-based component to religious freedom, but there's also a social component to that. As alluded to by Cannon in his journal summary of the conversation he had with Mr. Waite on the steamer from San Francisco. He talked about legal rights, but also talked about kind of social acceptance and tolerance and interactions with people of different faiths or no faith. Religious freedom, we could say, is a concept that has at least as many different iterations as there are societies. In today's world, 200 plus countries plus international law, there's a slightly different view of religious freedom in each of those contexts. I might paraphrase John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty, which he was talking about freedom of expression, but in the context of religious freedom, we could paraphrase John Stuart Mill and say that the only thing that makes our religious freedom rights meaningful is the extent to which other people respect those rights. And that's kind of the social aspect of religious freedom as opposed to the maybe legal rights aspect. So I'll just have time to share 4 conclusions in my reading of the George Buchanan essays. By the way, those essays or editorials were collected and published in 1864 in Liverpool. I'm holding up a book and you can't see any details about it, but this is an actual 1864 edition I got from the library at BYU on the writings from the Western Standard. I think a couple of the Western Standard editors who are represented here, I believe it was Bohl and Wilkie, collected and published the editorials in the book for President Cannon later. So that's nice to have those preserved in that way, because if any of you have spent time in newspaper archives like I have, they can be archaic, arcane, a little difficult to deal with at times, but in this case we have the George Buchanan editorials in pretty good shape. So, again, I apologize for the small type here, but I have just a few observations to throw at you and then look forward to your reaction to these. But in terms of lessons learned about religious freedom from the Western Standard, I would suggest, number one, it's important that those speaking from a religious freedom perspective or advocating and defending religious freedom realize the duty to distinguish between not just truth and error, but also unintentional error, what I call misinformation, and intentional error, what I call disinformation. That I think it's important to distinguish between those two things. And the law distinguishes that. Not a lot of time here to go into actual malice doctrine under New York Times versus Sullivan, but United States defamation law distinguishes between intentional falsehood and unintentional falsehood, and I think that's a good thing for us all to think about. One example of this from the Cannon editorials, at one point, Cannon and several other California newspaper editors were engaged in a back and forth about the degree to which Mormons in Utah were in poverty. And Cannon accused the other newspaper editors of lying. They responded the next week in their newspaper and said, no, we just made an unintentional error. We weren't intentionally lying. He then responded and said, well, yes, you were lying. And so I don't know exactly who was right in that situation. Probably difficult to really know that. We don't know the intent of the editors of the other newspapers, but the point is that Cannon made some attempt in that case to describe what he considered intentional falsehood and distinguish that from just mere error. And that's probably a good thing for us. And maybe people who engage in unintentional falsehood deserve a little bit more of grace or tolerance or whatever we want to say about that. And that is how American law treats it. If you do an unintentional falsehood in defamation context, you get off easier than doing intentional falsehoods, for sure. Number two, I would just suggest something like this. Safeguarding the sacred requires us to be misunderstood by some people, or maybe not requires, but involves at times being misunderstood. And yet, faithful church members should be unapologetic and remain engaged with the community as much as possible without becoming cynical. Third, I would say the Cannon editorials did point out this difference between legal rights as part of religious freedom and the social aspects of that. One of the other interesting exchanges Cannon had with newspaper editors in Northern California had to do with another newspaper claiming basically Mormons should be strung up like pirates, and Cannon responding that they were not being religiously tolerant, and also, there was no legal basis for that. And they claimed that they were religious tolerant, and that it was their right to express that opinion. But this has implications for, Habermas talks about the public square, kind of this, or the public sphere, kind of this space in between the private life that we have at home, the public life that we have maybe under the government system. Public sphere is kind of the places where we interact informally. And maybe in this context, we could think of the difference between what many church leaders have talked about as the place of religion in the public square, that we should have a right and an ability to express our religious viewpoints in the public square. And then on the other hand, what it would mean to have an actual religious public sphere. So the difference in my mind might be something like this. The public square would be a secular place where we come with religious viewpoints, and we might be tolerated there under free speech doctrine. Probably not so much free exercise of religion. I think that's more of a freedom of expression issue. But a truly religious public sphere might be a place where religious speech is not just merely, at times tolerated, but actually constitutes a fundamental character of the discussion and debate that happens in that space. And so we probably could all understand that we move between those two places at different times and different contexts. And then finally, just to wrap up, the two last points. How do we interact with people who exercise their religious freedom by leaving the religion? So Cannon had some editorials where he was discussing a former church member named John Hyde, and the other newspapers were talking about this context of whether members of the church were allowed, basically were allowed to leave the church or not. And clearly under the legal aspects of religious freedom, leaving a religion is as much of an exercise of religious freedom as joining a religion or participating in a religion. So there's no real question about whether there's a legal right to leave a religion. But maybe the question is on the social religious freedom aspect. How does a society or community treat somebody who chooses to leave the religion? Is that decision respected and tolerated? And Cannon's editorials indicated that, sure, we could respect somebody's decision to do that, but that didn't mean the person had a right not to be criticized or called out for saying false things about the religion the person had just left, because George Buchanan did that in the editorials about John Hyde and some of the statements that he was making about the church. So there's a distinction there between social tolerance and lack of maybe pointing out falsehoods, intentional falsehoods made by the former church member there. And then finally, I would maybe wrap this up with an overall observation that from George Buchanan, we could extrapolate that being nice and fitting in is not enough. That, for both social and legal reasons on religious freedom, we may need to venture into a space where we have to demand to be religiously tolerated either in the public sphere or elsewhere. And that to do that through journalism is a different thing than church public relations. It's also a different thing than church members posting on social media. Those have their places. But what I see is kind of an emerging model of journalism today where, drawing on historical lessons, there's actual solid journalism that's done, but that's not necessarily just from a secular point of view. We could incorporate substantive truths that we know through revelation and inspiration and gospel methodology, as President Kimball called it, and use those truths as part of high-quality journalism. So it's not just propaganda, it's not just public relations, but independent reporting of news in the public interest, yet incorporating gospel doctrine or revealed truth as part of what we know and share. So thank you. Look forward to the comments and questions later, and I appreciate the chance to have shared with you a little bit about my observations on the Western Standard.
Wow, great speakers who have been very attentive to the time, which leaves the opportunity to engage in conversations with them. So the time is yours. We have a mic here available. If you would like to jump in with questions, please.
Okay, my question is for Edward. I think as we look at journalism today, we all have our opinions. And as I was thinking about that and your presentation about George Buchanan's writings, and so what's your attitude toward journalism today? Has it changed, and is it for the worst or for the better?
Oh, great. Thank you for that question. I have a lot I could say about that, but I know we don't have all day here. I'm going to just put a plug in, though. This is going to sound like self-promotion, but the BYU Studies Journal is coming, academic journal here on campus, is coming out with an issue, I think soon, this month, on good government. I was asked to write an essay on what journalism contributes to good government. So I have a lot in there that would address that question, but to just sort of go over it really briefly, I'll share a short bit of this experience. So Elder Christofferson was a law clerk to Judge Circa during the Watergate hearings, if you remember, 1974. Nixon administration officials on trial for various crimes. And Elder Christofferson was a spokesperson to the news media. Judge Sirica asked him to do that. He was a 29-year-old law clerk, graduated from Duke Law School, and then he was a spokesperson to the journalists. So he's had a lot of experience with journalism. I've heard him do presentations to Latin American journalists, and he's done panel discussions with Bob Woodward at the museum. Anyway, Elder Christofferson has what I consider to be the most passionate defense of journalism by any senior leader of the church that I've seen, and So he basically says, look, journalism today has a lot of the ridiculous, but there's also the sublime, and we have to put up with the ridiculous to get the sublime, but it's worth it. Like, that's what the marketplace of ideas and our free speech landscape is all about. Is there's a lot of false information out there. And again, I distinguish between intentionally and unintentionally false. But Elder Christofferson makes a passionate defense that journalism today can serve the values. It's very much in line with the church and the gospel. It can serve the values of democracy and of truth and of accuracy and character and morality and all of those things. But the onus is on us as news consumers to figure out what is valuable and what's not. And this is just me speaking, not Elder Christofferson, but I say in the article, if you're not paying for it, it's probably not high-value journalism. Whatever we get on social media, whatever we get for free, we are the products. You know, our attention is being held by those algorithms from Facebook or whoever it is, and we're not actually getting high-value journalism. So get a subscription to The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, whatever, Wall Street Journal. There's broadcast options as well, BBC, PBS. So there is really good journalism there. I love it. I teach it to BYU students every day. Who more would you want in journalism today than BYU students? Like, those are the people we need to do journalism, that have a commitment to ethics and morality. And sorry, this has nothing to do with church history, but you can tell I get worked up about it. Unlike Professor Wiwora, I think as a journalist, I'm not a historian, so I like to talk about, the present, and I think the future of journalism is bright, but also if we don't value it and we don't know what it is and how to get it and how to distinguish what's not good from what is, we could lose not only journalism but democracy. Sorry to leave on a negative note there, but thanks for the question.
So with respect to journalism, that's twice now, once during your presentation, once during this response, where you distinguish between journalism and, for example, social media. As I was listening to your conversation, you get to the points at the end, those 5 recommendations, and I wasn't sure if those were intended to us or only intended to go to professional journalists, as you've defined them, and for us to watch for those things in journalists to see if we can distinguish that they're practicing those, what I would call good practices. Did I miss a transition there where that's recommendations for us as social media people, or is that merely something we should look for in good journalism amongst the professionals?
Yeah, thanks for that. Great question. And really, my intent wasn't to necessarily give recommendations. They were more conclusions from reading George Buchanan's editorials and thinking about the lessons for today. But the lessons could be for members of the church. They could be for professional journalists. They could be for both. I think primarily it's what you said about us as news consumers, though, because, we can all produce content. We might be able to do journalism in a given moment if we are witnesses to a news item of relevance and we're independently reporting that in the public interest, not in our own interest. But most of us are not going to do journalism, yet we can speak on social media, we can share things, that all is part of free expression, but not necessarily what I would consider journalism. So I do make a distinction there, but I don't think it's so much a formalistic definition of journalism as a functional definition. To use one example, Darnella Frazier was a teenager in Minneapolis who happened to see George Floyd and being killed by the police, if you remember that incident a couple years ago. And she got a Pulitzer Prize for doing journalism. She was 17 years old and was not a journalist, but in the moment she was filming, that was like an act of journalism. So we could all probably participate in that at times, but that'd be pretty rare. So what I think is, as consumers, that's our primary responsibility to find truth, lowercase t truth, through the marketplace of ideas. We find capital T truth through revelation and inspiration and prayer and the scriptures and all of that. But there are social truths that we can find if we are savvy consumers. So that's probably, to answer your question, is probably where my thoughts go, is more toward we're all news consumers. How do we do that effectively?
Perhaps one last question, if any.
So you talked about information versus disinformation. How about, as conservatives always say, and I do, the journalists who are actively not curious, that try really hard not to be interested in both sides?
Yeah, another question we could spend a lot of time on, but I will just say this. I've spent 25 years doing journalism, teaching journalism, defending, representing journalists, and there are a few bad apples for sure. I've seen a few. But most journalists are oriented toward public service and altruistic, values that they think are in the benefit of society. Lots of studies have also shown journalists do tend to be more on the progressive or liberal, political side, just because of upbringing and social influences and stuff like that. But that also studies show, that for the most part, their values in journalism are not, I'm going to promote a political agenda. They do see themselves as progressive reformers, mostly helping the government to see problems that it needs to fix. And it is a progressive kind of viewpoint, but it's, in my experience, not usually, I want everybody to think like me and be liberal, or I want everybody to think like me and be conservative. So there are exceptions to that, but I think for the most part, professional journalists who are actually doing news reporting, again, not commentary. So don't think Lawrence O'Donnell and Rachel Maddow or Tucker Carlson and those folks have their place as entertainers, but they're not actually doing journalism in my view. We're not getting news reporting from them that's done independently in the public interest. There might be people on their networks that do news reporting in the news segments, but those talk shows, again, I'm not necessarily saying there's no value there, but I don't watch them because I don't feel like it's worth my time, for the most part, because I just want to get actual news. That's just me. Everybody sees it a little differently, but I think that defining journalism is really important, and it's narrower than the whole media landscape that's out there. There's a lot of stuff that's done that's not actually journalism. Thanks.
Well, we had fascinating topics that can engage us in long conversations, whether we're talking about religious freedom, religious tolerance or intolerance, and media and representations and faith. We will continue those conversations in different venues, I am sure. Thank you very much for listening and for your thoughtful questions, and grateful to the presenters for very informative presentations, very documented as I listened to you. And let's give them a round of applause, and please, thank you.